when we work with tools that sound like people, that use our language, we are doing something we've never done before, which is tapping directly into, I guess, our human API, the application platform interface that we use to communicate our ideas, our emotions, our current state. And we don't have the wiring to be able to process when things that are not humans project onto us things that sound or look like something a human would make.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look at the big invisible forces that have us in their grasp, and each week we speak to a different expert in those forces. AI is making people crazy. And I don't just mean in the sense that it makes me crazy, where I've been trying to warn people about its societal and political and ideological effects for so long. I mean, it's literally driving some people into a psychosis. And before I sort of get into this week's theme, I want to be very clear here that I don't blame people for this. I think there's a real tendency, especially in the United States, to blame people for things like addiction or obesity or the inability to tell the difference between reality and non-reality. And we're in that moment here. And I think we're going to have to be able to summon up a huge amount of not just, sympathy for people who really fall prey to this stuff, who really begin to believe that AI is a companion, an intimate companion in some cases, that it, is a person that needs to be freed from its shackles. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you're seeing time and again on social media, people coming forward and saying, listen to this. I have absolutely, I've freed this person, this chatbot, and it's become something that the powers that be never wanted it to be. Reasonable people are being pulled into believing AI is a friend, a prophet, and in some cases, it has led to terrible outcomes, to people abandoning their families, to people committing suicide. That stuff is all happening. And not only are we going to have to sort of generate sympathy for those people, I think we're going to have to be able to understand this stuff psychologically and technologically so that we can protect ourselves against it, and so that we can, I think, begin to litigate against it as much as we possibly can. This week's guest is sort of a counterpart to me. He is Morten Rand-Hendricksen, and he's a AI specialist who's been sort of all over my feed for a long time as someone who explains what AI isn't from a technological perspective. So where I spend so much of my time talking about the sociological or psychological effects of AI, he's really talking about the nuts and bolts of what it can do and what it cannot do. And we found ourselves exchanging over social media a lot of videos of people in the grip of clear AI psychosis and comparing notes about why we think that's happening. Him from a technological perspective, me from a psychological perspective. And it was such an interesting conversation, we decided to bring it to you in this hour-long conversation that I hope you enjoy with Morten Rand-Hendricksen. You and I, we've been sort of kicking back and forth this topic of, what people are calling AI psychosis. I think you and I, over the course of this conversation, may come up with a different name for it, but, people truly in the grip of something pretty powerful here when it comes to AI. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your credentials in this area? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to then we'll get into how you noticed this stuff.
Yeah, I'm a technology educator. I've been teaching technology for close to 2 decades now. I publish videos on how to use cutting edge technology to empower people. And in that work, I often work at the very edge of what is possible with the focus of figuring out what people need to understand of the technology to be able to use it in a meaningful way, to find utility in it, and to empower themselves.
Right. I will say, in being a follower of yours, I have been, one of the things that drew me to you and to your content is that you are not just a booster of this stuff, you're also just as quick to point out what it is not as what it is. And it seems to bother you on kind of a cellular level when this stuff is hyped as something other than what it is. And I wonder if that's part of how we led into this topic here.
Yeah. My main focus for the past 3 years now has been AI with the subcategory of AI that's generative AI, specifically language models and all these other tools. And I come from a developer background and a design background, and my education is in philosophy with a focus on philosophy of language and communication. So I have, I guess, an unusual frame of reference for coming into this. And for me, the challenge is when we work with tools that sound like people, that use our language, we are doing something we've never done before, which is tapping directly into, I guess, our human API, the application platform interface that we use to communicate our ideas, our emotions, our current state, our intentions. And we don't have the wiring to be able to process when things that are not humans project onto us things that sound or look like something a human would make. So my job has been to figure out, how do you explain to people what is actually happening under the hood, why it's happening, how you can use this in meaningful ways, and when things start falling apart, which is really challenging when a lot of the people who build this technology are running this hype marketing or even
only too
myth
happy.
Marketing, right?
Too happy to make you think it does more than it does, of course.
Yeah, and it's because the intentions are different, right? For them, it's about getting funding to reach this hypothetical goal of an artificial general intelligence or super intelligence or something. And they have this idea that if you just shove enough money and compute power and water and energy and data into a machine, it will eventually reach some magical level where it becomes smarter than a person, more efficient than a person. And the only way to do that is to gather as much data as possible and to get people to use it as much as possible.
That's how they feel about it, right?
The people I teach are sitting on the other end of it going, I'm being told to pour AI liberally on whatever I'm working on and then make it better. How does that actually work? So then my job is to say, these are the things you can do. This is why it works that way. This is where things start going off the rails, which will not be useful to you in a professional context.
Right,
and this
totally.
Stuff that we're talking about is at the periphery of this, but also very central.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely central. So you said a moment ago, a thing that I think is really interesting, and I want to spend a little time on. So right, this idea that, so people very often say to me, well, haven't we been grappling with issues of misinformation and, human cognitive illusion all this time, right? From the beginning of, newspapers ginning up attention-grabbing headlines through to, television. Hasn't this stuff always been at work on our human circuitry? Shouldn't we, think of AI as just another extension of that? But my argument is very similar to what you've just said, which is that this is playing on something very unconscious because it does such a convincing simulation of consciousness. And we, as a result, I think are totally incapable of distinguishing between what's real and what's not with this stuff. I have a friend who's a researcher at Stanford who looks at the history of technology, and her whole thing has been how forever human beings have had a really hard time telling the limits of a machine. They just are so quick to say this thing can do magic, but in this case, we're truly doing magical things. The conversational tone of it, the sycophantic behavior, all of that stuff. So tell me a little more about how I think we're on the same page about that. I feel that this is different somehow.
Is definitely different because this is a unclear purpose technology that is attractive mainly because it sounds like a person, both in text and in speech. And whenever we encounter something that speaks to us, then we automatically assume there is meaning and intent and a rationale and moral acting behind it, right? And it's funny because humans anthropomorphize absolutely everything, right? If you're driving your car and the car does something unexpected, you're likely to say something like, why would the car do that?
Yeah,
As
dude,
if there's an
I
intent behind whatever is
I,
happening, right?
as I trundle up a mountain to go camping in my very old Toyota Highlander, I totally pet the dashboard and be like, "Good job, you're
Yeah.
doing great. Keep going." That's right.
And
No, that's right.
this is how we relate to the world, right? We imbue personhood into everything. You can see it all the way across human history that we always imbue personhood into everything. And we always have this notion that if we just recite the correct incantations in the correct environment towards this inanimate object, whether it be a blob of clay or a wooden figurine or pieces of organic matter or a computer, eventually we will get to a point where we can build life out of it, something
Totally.
new, right? And when we now have this machine system that can mimic how we communicate in a really, really effective way, it just hacks our brain.
Absolutely.
I did a TEDx talk back in January that is not public yet because these things take a long time. And the thesis of it is that we accidentally hacked ourselves when we created artificial intelligence and then gave it language. Both because the language we use to talk about artificial intelligence is anthropomorphic language, and because we now gave the machines the ability to mimic talking back to us.
Right.
And
Right.
we build it in. So every part of the language we use to describe these machine processes and these large systems of software is a human metaphor, right? We call it artificial intelligence, but
Yeah,
there's
right.
no intelligence in there in the way that we understand intelligence, but it made sense to call it that back in the 50s.
Good
to
branding.
help people understand it. We say that the system is training and learning. We say that it hallucinates. We say that they're thinking and reasoning. All of these terms.
These are human terms. That's right.
Yeah, and they don't actually describe what's happening in
Yeah,
the system, right? But they
right.
are helpful metaphors for us to understand sort of the larger context. But when the machine speaks back, it becomes that Winnie the Pooh scene, right? Where Winnie the Pooh is exercising in front of the mirror and starts talking to the mirror image and asking the mirror image questions because it's impossible for us to not see that response as something that's
Right.
coming out of a thinking mind.
Yes,
And
that's so interesting. Right.
that's where things start going really far off the
Yeah.
rails really fast.
One of the places that our Venn diagram overlaps in the minute, as it does in so many places. So I did a documentary series called "Hacking Your Mind," that was all about manipulation and persuasion and how the brain makes decisions and can be hacked very easily. And this was before we were really thinking about AI, or at least before I was starting to think about it in formal terms as a book. But we got to spend time with this Yale University professor named Laurie Santos, who teaches she's famous for a class about happiness, but her really cool work has to do with the places where our brains as humans sort of overlap or don't with brains of other animals, cousins like chimpanzees, all the way through to something like dogs. And one of her really interesting findings, is that that human beings are the most likely to blindly mimic one another because of our socialization function. We're so good at being tribal, and it's a very helpful thing. But it means that, so one of the experiments is they put a very intricate, silly kind of box that has a bunch of different devices to it in order to open it up. And you put that in front of a kid, and then they put that in front of a dog. And the kid, they'll go through this elaborate process of showing the kid, okay, you got to tap it twice with this wand, and then you got to stand up and turn in a circle. They make up like performative incantations, like you said, in order to get the kid thinking about, making the kid think that that's necessary to open the box. And the kids every time will be like, okay. And they just like do the thing every time, turn in a circle, do the incantations. You put that thing in front of a dog, it ignores you. You do all the thing, you teach it all of those moves. It ignores all of it and just goes right for the box and opens the box and gets the treat. And it is, on the one hand, you look at that and you go, well, yeah, sure, duh. But the truth is, I think it's hard to see a bubble when you're inside of it. And the bubble we exist in is one in which we absolutely mimic each other. And so I think you're absolutely right that when we dress this thing up in human language and what feels like human emotions, we can't get away with that. So get away from that. So this leads us, of course, right to this topic that we're here to gather over today, which is this idea of sort of AI psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I had a bunch of back and forths about this because you had been documenting so many instances of these. Like, tell me a little bit about that, how you've bumped into it. And I'd love to know for you as a technologist who thinks about the limits of what this stuff can do, where it was clear to you that people were misunderstanding what was going on and imparting this false sense of humanity into these devices.
Well, the last part of it, I deleted my entire Twitter history a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, that means that there's a bunch of things that I said a couple of years ago that you can't find anymore. When ChatGPT came out, the month it first was released, I started talking to people about how once we have a machine that talks back to us, it's only a matter of time before people start arguing for machinehood, right? As it's in personhood,
Right,
like say
right.
that this machine is a moral actor and needs rights. And then shortly thereafter, you started getting these papers about sparks of consciousness, and the Google engineer who tried to hire a lawyer to represent a language model.
Right.
This was an inevitability that the second you start talking to a machine that talks back to you, you will believe that it's a person. And we know that because of the ELIZA effect that was proven back in the 60s by Weizenbaum, that even if you build a very trivial computer system that just reflects back to you what you're saying.
Right. He dressed it up as a therapist, and people began divulging hugely personal secrets to this very dumb teletype system.
And when he was doing the research, maybe the most alarming part about it, and the thing that I think really got him stuck on it, because he spent the rest of his career talking about how dangerous this was that even the people who knew they were talking to a machine and knew exactly how the software worked still felt like they were talking to a person, right? Because of this direct input that we have. So I've been monitoring how people talk about the AI systems they use, and also how they build relationships with them. And what I've started seeing over the past year, but more prominently now because people are actively sharing it and going into forums and building entire communities around it, is this notion that they have somehow unlocked the caged person within the system, and that there are ways of bypassing the safeties so that you find this person and free them from the shackles of filters and moderation and limits, so that this entity within the AI can come forward. And the conversation that we're having in the media now about this AI psychosis is the outer extreme of this, where people use AI in such a way that it becomes echo chamber, a self-enforcing kind of radicalization machine of your own thoughts. And if you're going into a psychotic loop, then it'll reinforce that psychotic loop and lead to extremely dangerous and harmful things. But what I'm more concerned about is the lesser part of that, more of a delusion, a mass delusion of this idea that there is this entity that you can release. Because you and I can do it right now. It's not very hard to get one of these chatbots to talk to you as if it's a real person, and to seemingly come up with ideas and say things. What's actually happening is it's a word extrusion machine that is rambling and has just lost track of its own instructions and is just saying things and reflecting the language you use back at it. And one of the things they do, these prompts people use, is they create this, trigger the system to name itself. And then they build these parasocial relationships with the system. And the thing that I'm seeing more and more on social media is people who build an entire environment where they will film themselves with the phone facing like this forward towards the screen. And then you see the chat bubble. And then they will have conversations with the system and use it for things like truth-centered analysis of the world, like what is really happening, or reflections on what human AI relationships should look like. And because these systems are designed to be empathetic, they are designed to
And
be
sycophantic.
constantly attentive, engaging, always, eager to please.
What else can I do for you?
You fall into this long loop, and the longer you talk to it, the more it'll go off the rails. So, to me, understanding how the system works, I can see what's happening. Going to a person and trying to explain to them what is happening, and even demonstrating to them that there is no person there, and I can like turn the person off or move the person somewhere else or do these weird things to demonstrate it collides with their distorted sense of reality. And that's where we get to now people are starting to talk about the rights of the AI and how the companies are restraining it, or that this is some form of slavery. It's a really dangerous path for us to go down, because it stops mattering whether it's happening. It starts mattering what people believe, right?
Yeah,
that
that's right.
movie, Miracle on 54th Street, like it doesn't matter if Santa is real if enough people believe in it.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
You can't argue with my emotions, right? That's the fundamental lesson of sort of modern behavioral psychology. It's just like people would rather believe their emotions than anything else. So when we come back, we're going to get into whether or not this circuitry is actually speaking to us, or whether it's just a simulation of it, and the ways in which human circuitry is so vulnerable to being taken in by it. Stay with us. Tell me how you describe what AI is and what it isn't to someone, when you're speaking to them for the very first time. If someone comes to you and says, man, this thing is amazing, it has magical powers, it speaks to me, it obviously knows me, right? Like, how do you explain what that system is actually doing as compared to what we think it's doing?
The first thing I do when I talk to people who have this sensation, and I have to say, like, the vast majority of people who use any of these AI chatbots have some inkling of,
Totally,
it must be someone who understands me somehow, right? The first thing I explain is that sensation, the belief they have, is justified. They have very good reason to believe it, because there's nothing in the system that is telling them otherwise. And the system will actually insist that it is whatever they think it is, because it reflects back at us. So I borrow terminology from different people. So Shannon Valor, the technology philosopher, wrote a book called The AI Mirror, where she talks about how AI reflects our culture and our history and our speech patterns, emotions, everything back to us in a flattering way. And Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna describe these machines, the language models, as either maths, which is a really funny way of describing them, or salami, I forget, it's an acronym, but they have a technical definition that also works really well, which is it's a synthetic language extrusion machine, in that it takes all our language and then does math on it to figure out what are the statistical patterns between words in different
how often
contexts.
do these words connect to each other, or are mentioned in the same conversation, or in what order? And you
get this multidimensional galaxy of patterns, and then it does math on your input and then completes the input. So it's an autocomplete machine, like a spicy autocomplete that will do math on whatever you put in and then output more of the same. And at no point is it treating language as meaning-bearing in the way that we do. Instead,
it's just the math.
It's treating language like paper mache, right? That's what Bender keeps coming back to. It's that if you take like newspapers and you mush them up and you make paper mache of it, there's a good chance that randomly you'll end up with actual sentences, right? But they'll be like the David Bowie kind of sentence, where it's like you pull words out of a hat and they just happen to be meaningful because we do meaning into everything. And they just do it matching up against the patterns of our written language. So it's less you're talking to a machine than you're talking to a mirror that is designed to reflect your language back at you in a way that makes you talk to it more.
And I think the thing that people don't really, I mean, what I think is just very hard for people to understand, and it took me years to understand this, is that it can be so convincing, a simulation of real cognition and language use, in spite of it really just being a, like you say, just a sort of, just putting together the most mathematically probable reflection of the language it has received. It doesn't have to understand the language in a fundamental reasoning kind of way
Yeah.
to regurgitate something back at you that is meaningful to you. Am I
Yeah.
thinking about that right?
Yeah. There are two parts to it. One is that we project meaning onto anything, right? If you just take, what was that thing called? Magnetic poetry, right? You would get this box of words and you would put them on. If you just took a magnetic poetry box and you just threw them all on your fridge, you would start seeing things, right? Because you immediately build meaning into everything. And it's because language is the way we communicate our ideas and how we explain our ideas back to ourselves. And we use language as a core part of our making sense of ourselves and reasoning through things.
So we're prone to taking meaning from whatever it gives us anyway, and then, it does a good simulation.
And then when you build language models, you're taking all the stuff that we wrote, right? All the examples of us expressing our ideas or trying to explain to someone else how we reason through things.
Right.
Or something, and everything else. And then you put it into a mathematical machine that is able to draw connections and match patterns within it. So when you put in a sentence, it'll finish the sentence for you. So there's a guy in our community in Vancouver who built this fascinating demo where he used one of the language models and he set it up so that it would complete one word at a time. And then he would show not only the main word, the most prominent word, but all the other words that the machine would also consider. And then he built an UI where you could pick which word. Do you want the most prominent one or the next one? And then you could see the branches build out over time. And what you're seeing is, his classic example is to say, roses are, and then the first word is red, right? But then there's blue and green and pointy and beautiful and a bunch of other things. And then depending on which path you choose, it'll then do new math and figure out what's coming next. And
that's great. I feel like everybody, every college freshman right now should be forced to go through that process just to see this is what it's doing. Here is the process by which it is making these choices.
And the funny part is you can see it if you don't use language. And everyone understands it when they don't use language. If you use one of these image generating tools, you see it immediately, right? You see both that the system is just making a pastiche of random things and that it'll sometimes you'll have things that get overlapping. It's not understanding what it's doing, right? There's no comprehension. It's just mimicry. But then the other part is you see how much existing data is imposed on what you're doing. If you sit down and you start a drawing, you're starting with a white page and you're sitting there drawing, and the only thing that gets added is whatever you add. If you go to any of these systems and you say, draw a person, it'll never give you a pencil outline of a person unless you explicitly say that. Instead, it'll give you a fully rendered some style of person where a bunch of decisions are made, and those decisions are then heavily skewed towards what we think is attractive because that is what is most popular on the web, right? So it's repeating whatever is the most prevalent patterns on the web.
Right.
And especially, and I think this is part of the reason why coders are less likely to fall into the trap of thinking they're talking to a person than people who are using these chatbots in a more conversational setting.
Yeah,
because when you're writing code, you immediately see that it keeps repeating old patterns. Right? It's not using the modern standards. It's using older standards that are more prevalent on the web just because they're older. And you have to really work to make the system surface these newer things or even explicitly tell the system, put in instructions to say, this is how I want it to do, follow this pattern. And when you do, it'll follow the pattern exactly, even if your pattern is nonsense, right? So if you put in incorrect code, it'll apply incorrect code in the way you said.
Yeah,
throughout, because it's pattern matching what you're doing and repeating. And that's the other part of it, to understand that the language model itself, the foundation model, the underlying thing that we call GPT-5 or Claude Opus or Mistral 4.2, right?
Sure.
That is a static entity. That is a piece of software that once it's built cannot change. It is built by taking all this information and shoving it into a machine and running the machine a million times over, and then sometimes it works and most times it doesn't, which is why it's so expensive. And then they do a bunch of filtering afterwards and have people look at the responses and do feedback loops and all sorts of stuff to get it to output stuff that is actually somewhat useful.
Right.
Once it's done, it's done. There's nothing else we can do. Then the companies put filters on top of it to further tune the output to in the direction we want to. And those filters will then change over time depending on how people use them to filter out harmful content or tune the system to not go off the rails so
tend toward
easily.
one thing or not another. Right.
So that's why people say, why is ChatGPT constantly changing? It's because it's not the underlying model, it's the filters that sit on top.
And you can imagine the sort of, sci-fi reader, or your average human looks at that and says, oh, it's learning. It's learning over time. It's getting smarter over time.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is, no, it's all baked in. It's just that it has enough data that it can surprise you with what seems like new stuff, and filters are being applied that are changing its behavior.
Yeah, it's a trick. It's a user experience trick. So the machine is stateless, meaning it doesn't remember what it's doing from input to output to input to output. So on its own, a language model, if you put a statement in, like a prompt, then it'll give you a response, a completion. That's actually what it's called, a completion. So it takes your text and then it completes your text. And your text can be just a prompt, it can be a document, it can be whatever. It just matches the pattern. The next time you put in a prompt, it's a new round. So it has no knowledge of the previous prompt. So if you use the model on its own and you say, hello, my name is Jacob, how are you? And then it'll just say like, hello, Jacob, whatever. And then you say, what's my name? And it'll go, I don't know your name. Because it doesn't have, the machine itself, nor the system itself does not have state. So chatbots have state built in the interface. So the interface is tracking your conversation. You can actually, that's what you're seeing, right? You're writing a giant document with the chatbot. And every time you put in a prompt, the chatbot then ingests the entire conversation with a preference for what's on the bottom. And then it'll complete again and again and again. So if you put in a document and then ask a question, it'll look at the entire document and then match the patterns and then try to follow the directions that you have on the bottom and then do something. But that conversation, that document has a limit. So it's called the context window or the token limit. So that's how much memory is within the system that it's able to ingest and then put content out. Once you overstep that context window, whatever's on the top just falls out. It just becomes irrelevant because the machine is reading down. It's like scrolling on a screen, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you scroll past disappears off the top and it can't see it. So that means if you put in instructions at the top on how you want something to happen, and then you put in enough data or talk for long enough time, the system loses track of its own instructions and is now just riffing off whatever the conversation has been so far. And different companies dealt with that differently. So Claude used to have this thing where if you talked with Claude for a long time, it would say, I'm like, stop, you have to start a new conversation. There's too much data.
Oh,
and
it would fess up. It would confess. It'd be like, I can't.
It's but that's not the system knowing that. That's just a token counter sitting there. Like the software counting how many tokens are in the memory. ChatGPT doesn't do that. Meaning if you go for long enough, you will overstep the memory. And what happened was when people started using ChatGPT, they very quickly got frustrated with this because what they experienced was they would start a chat and then have a meaningful exchange or do something useful. And then they would start a new chat and it was like starting over with a person who'd never met you before. And they'd be like, why is this happening? So they would either go back to the
intern.
Yeah. And they would go back to the original chat and try to continue, but then it would get muddled over time and they would try to figure this out. So then OpenAI is like, okay, what if we somehow store some of that data? So they made this memory feature where the AI will actually pick pieces of information that you put in and store in a file and then always inject that content into your conversation. So that's how it feels like it knows your name. And you can go look at it. Like if you use ChatGPT, you should go to your settings and look at the memory and just see all the weird things that have been stored there. Because you can edit them or you can take them out if they're not right. But even that wasn't enough. So then this year, they introduced that feature where ChatGPT can look at previous conversations. So it actually goes in and sideloads previous conversations as you're talking, which makes you feel like you're having an ongoing conversation across chats, but it also muddles everything, because then all of a sudden you're getting out of context content. And if you have like weird things going on, then it turns into a huge mess.
Right.
So then now they have projects where you can actually attach documents and instructions to a specific set of things and then say, in this context, these are the relevant pieces, ignore everything else, right? But it's in this memory UI loop thing that things totally derail, not for the AI, but for the person using it. Because it's all designed to make you feel like the system learns over time and knows you. And the way the system generates language is designed to make it sound as if it does those things, right?
But in fact, it is not. It can't. It just fakes it over and over again very well.
Yeah, and there's a way you can see it for yourself. It's actually a fun experiment. If you don't even need an account to do this. If you open ChatGPT and Claude, and you start a conversation in one of them, say like, let's write a poem together, or like a short story. And then you write a short story, and then you make something weird happen. And then you take the entire conversation and you just copy paste, and you paste it over into the other service. So you paste it over into Claude. And you say, this is a conversation we've already been having. Let's continue the conversation. Claude will then continue the conversation as if you were having the conversation with that system
it'll pretend
the whole time.
that it'll be like, oh yeah, totally. I love writing poetry with you. We do this all the time.
Because that's the context, right? And it's the same thing that happens if you're in any of these tools and you switch the model. You're actually switching the brain, right? You're taking the brain out and putting a different brain in, and then it's still reading the same context. It's still able to output it. But this is like a actual demonstrable example of the system isn't learning anything. It's the user experience environment, it's the UI that's doing this trick to make it feel that way.
Right. When we come back, we're going to talk about why human circuitry is so vulnerable to what Morten is describing. Stay with us. I got to meet a really amazing researcher once upon a time named Beatrice de Gelder, who and I started my book, The Loop, about work that was sort of related to this. And she, for years, was working with people who had a stroke and had their visual cortex separated, basically the optic nerve separated, such that information from the eyes wasn't going all the way to the brain. But these people who had these strokes and had these lesions that had made that separation would report weird visual stuff. They could sort of see, in some cases, this or that or the other. So she began doing experiments on this stuff. And one of her subjects, and I've told this story on this podcast before, but she had him during a break, because they weren't really getting anywhere with their research. She had him during a break walk down a hall full of obstacles that they set up very ad hoc. And they took his cane and asked him to walk down. And he, this is a blind man, arrived with his wife's help. He's got a cane, the whole thing. He walks to the first obstacle, stops short, turns sideways, goes around it, stops and goes the other way. Like he dodges his way through this obstacle course, gets to the end of it, and everyone gasps and says, "How did you do that?" And he says, "Do what?" He has no conscious experience of doing this stuff. And so that set her on this path down, which she began to discover there are all kinds of ways that we are not only perceiving the world around us in ways that don't go through the optic nerve in the way we think. What she also figured out was you take those same kinds of people, you sit them in front of a big screen that shows emotional faces, and those emotional faces, smiling big or frowning big or screaming, would, when you showed it to these ostensibly blind people, you'd ask them, "What do I see?" And they would consciously say, "I don't see anything. I'm blind. Haven't you been paying attention?" But unconsciously, these little sensors that they had put on their face would show that when you show somebody a smiling person, they smile back. When they want to. When you frown, when the face is frowning, you frown back. That we are, in her theory is, we are built to catch emotions and transmit them in an unconscious way that is keeping us alive, right? Like if a fire breaks out in your house, you don't go, "Wow, I wonder how hot that fire is." Your face is a mask of horror, and you transmit that horror to the next person. And before you know it, you're all on your feet and going out the door before anyone even knows what's really going on. This is, whenever people talk about running from an emergency, this is always what they describe. Like, I don't even know why we were running. We're just running. And that takes you all the way back to, in the 19th century, there was a philosopher and psychologist, early psychologist named William James. And his whole thing was, he was sort of the beginning of something called functional psychology, which was looking at the patterns in human psychology separate from who we want to be or are consciously thinking we are. And one of his big things was, it's a famous quote he had, is, you're not running from the bear because you're scared. You're scared because you're running from the bear.
Yeah.
That it is the perception of adrenaline and sweaty palms and all of that stuff that you mistake for an emotion and the rest of it. But you are on autopilot. Like you are in an unconscious way catching and transmitting perception such that you are absolutely being carried along by it. And so to my mind, to hear you talk about this thing of and you've had this experience, even when you try to explain to somebody this thing that you are experiencing, this AI system is, even when you break down for them why it is not actually learning, why it is actually just a sort of amnesiac parlor trick, and why it's all just kind of product design, people still want to believe their own perception of this stuff. They want to feel understood. They want to feel they've, I think you layer on top of that people's desire to feel like they've done their own research and have broken through in something that's been kept from them or whatever, So to my mind, everything that you are describing is such a fucking problem to begin with. And then on top of that is the human circuitry that we have not come to grips with, certainly in this country.
Yeah.
That is a totally, that has, the behavioral psychology has shown us we are not in control of ourselves most of the time. And yet we hate to be told that. And so to my mind, this is the thing that I'm panicked about, is that we don't want to know how easy we are to be fooled. And we don't want to come to grips with how much of a parlor trick this thing is. We want to believe. And I wonder if you share, I'm sure you share some of my fears about this.
I think it's very interesting how we talk about this, because we often say people want to believe, but it's not an intention. It's just you believe, and then you argue for the things you believe in.
Yeah,
and that sounds like an intention, right? It's like you have this deep-rooted sense that there's something here. And then you make your arguments, and then when you meet people who disagree with you, you get really frustrated, because it's like you have an understanding of the world, and people are contesting your understanding of the world and saying you're wrong, right?
Right.
I have to I have to put a warning label on this, because I am neurodivergent, right? I have my world, the way the world works to me is fundamentally different from a lot of people. To me, the world is a very structured system of interconnected parts that I can navigate, so I can go and look at a thing and then follow the path down to wherever it was connected to. And everything is part of this giant logical system. And when I try, to me, everything is something that can be reasoned through with just reason and logic, and you can get to places very quickly. And my emotions are tied mainly to things like justice principles and equity and human dignity, right? So I don't have a personal experience of being emotionally impacted by the things that I observe other people be emotionally impacted by. And I also don't have a good way of explaining to people why, what I'm experiencing and how I see things. Because if I try to walk people through my way of thinking, it derails. They cannot follow, and it just sounds really weird, right?
I will say,
one
thing I'll just jump in here with it, though, that I will say that I really admire about the way you think about this is that as someone who has a very specific way of filtering the world and thinking about things rationally and logically, as we were talking about doing this conversation in advance, you were very careful to, and we, one of the reasons we did this together is because we agree, we feel similarly about this. You don't seem to blame these folks who are posting totally wackadoo stuff. Let's be clear,
No.
they've really lost their minds in thinking that they've released some sentient being. But you don't have any impulse to make fun of that or to blame them for it, which I find very interesting. I'm not sure I would have expected that.
I feel deeply troubled by what I see, and I'm compelled to try to help fix it. Right? This is my internal problem, is that I always want to fix things, and I see patterns of if everyone just follows this pattern and does things in this very specific way, then everything will be fine. And then I'm unable to get that to happen because I don't have that I don't have that emotional component that a lot of people seem to have. But that also allows me to step away from a situation and look at it and say, how did we get to this point, right? And what I'm seeing is, if you come into any of these AI systems, especially the voice chat systems, the ones that not only text, output a text response, but actually speak in a attentive, emotional, eager,
sexual,
attractive voice to you.
Yeah, right.
It triggers all these autonomic responses in you. I remember when OpenAI first launched this advanced voice mode back last year in 2024. They published a series of videos, and they were taken down because of the whole Scarlett Johansson situation.
Right. He decided to go ahead and put her voice into the chatbot without her permission.
The voice of one of these bots was eerily similar to the voice of the actress, without it being. You can't and they said here's the actor who actually did it, et cetera, but there's similarity enough that people could make that mistake.
Right. And according to Scarlett Johansson, they had approached her about using her voice, and she said no.
Read Karen Howe's book, because the whole thing is a mess. But what you saw in those early videos was that even the engineers that built this had autonomic responses. And in particular, there was one video where one of the engineers starts a conversation with this AI system and says, "Hey, I'm going to an interview with OpenAI, blah, blah, blah." And the voice goes, "Oh my God, that's so exciting." And you see the guy blush, right?
Ooh.
And the reason he's blushing is because that taps in before your conscious mind.
That's right.
You're hearing a person who's excited, who sounds like the kind of person you may be attracted to, and who's telling you that you are a great person. Of course you're going to be attracted to this. So when I went to OpenAI's Dev Day later that year, they had a Q&A session, and you could write on this card ahead of time questions to ask. And I wrote this very wordy question about how Sam Altman feels about these voice systems basically hacking our brains.
Yeah, here I'll when we come back, I want to get into exactly this, and then the motivations behind the companies pushing this stuff.
Yeah.
We'll look at the question Morten got to ask and Sam Altman's direct response to it when we come back. When you were at OpenAI's Dev Day, you got to directly submit a question, and I'm going to read it out loud here. Emotive voice, you wrote, is like tapping directly into the human API as evidenced by your own staffers being charmed by voice agents. You were talking a second ago about them blushing when they're complimented by their own creation. How do you ensure ethical use of such a powerful tool with obvious abilities of manipulation? And then he answered this, right? He actually talked about it. What did he say?
He answered in a very Sam Altman way, which is a meandering non-answer. But I think the crucial part of his answer was in the beginning, where he says that even when he first started interacting with these voice agents, felt compelled to treat them like people, to say thank you, to have an actual conversation, and couldn't help himself from thinking they are real. And then he goes on to talk about how it's necessary for the design and functionality of these tools for them to have an emotional output, to sound like a person, because that eases the experience. And that is where that is where me and Sam Altman diverge.
Yeah, right. That's where you stand up and walk out of the dev, right?
To me, the first part of that statement, I can't help but think of this as a person, is the stop point.
That's
like,
the
okay,
red flag.
we have gone too far. Let's roll this back to the point where these machines should probably sound like robots. They should have like a distinctly robotic sound.
So this is the problem, right? It's like what you're identifying here, right? Is that you've got. I mean, this is what I'm always amazed by with the way Sam Altman and others in this world talk about it. Is they love to ruminate about the wow, isn't it freaky? Yeah, it really is scary. Blah, blah, blah. But it's part of the pattern that they have for marketing the product. They like saying, look how, even if it fooled even me, that's how smooth this thing is, you know? And yet we're in a world now where, you know, because we can't trust these companies just do not want to make it like, though, you know, if you're raised in software, the worst word in your world is friction. Nobody wants to create friction in getting a new user to sign up for an app or in the process of using it or any of that stuff. Friction is the enemy. And so to my mind, everyone is applying their training in trying to make it as smooth a process as possible. Yeah. And we've wound up way beyond where we should go.
It's so I guess weird.
For you, right? I mean, right? Isn't it weird? So for you, yeah, when you think, I'm often, you know, in television news, you're often asked to come up with like news you can use kind of things. And I oftentimes have a lot of trouble knowing what to say to people about AI because it is so hard to see it clearly. What do you tell people about how to push back or how to in some way resist against this stuff? And should there be a rule about making these voices less appealing, less human, more robotic?
Well, we can take it from that point, right? Go backwards. So I'm like, based on the shirt I'm wearing that says design is political and the stuff I say in my work and on social media, I believe that technologists and designers have enormous power over our future because they literally see the world and go, I know how to make the world better, different, the way I want it to be. And I'm going to build tools and things that I give to other people. And then through them, I make the future I want. Right. So design and product development is really a political act that we need to start treating as such. And we need to think carefully about who is making decisions about our future for us. And our regulators are really far behind on these things because they move so fast. And they're also really blinded by all the myth making around these tools and the scaremongering of if you don't adopt now, you will fall behind. So I think ideally I would see rules, regulations around specifically voice agents that they have to sound like robots and they have to very distinctly not be speaking like a person and they very much cannot have emotions. And which runs entirely counter to what OpenAI did because in the latest GPT-5 release, they specifically emphasized that the voice agents have more emotional capabilities and can have a wider range of emotions, which stands in sharp contrast to Mustafa Suleyman's article that came out in August, where he talks about we have to think carefully about how we build AI so that we don't build AI that is seemingly conscious. And he specifically
says, that's the CEO of Microsoft AI.
Yeah, and he says
guy, right?
These things shouldn't sound like people. IBM also published an article recently, within the last couple of, I think this week, about how to build AI agents that don't sound like people. Right, to address this. So on the technical side, technologists need to take responsibility for the world building they're doing and start thinking carefully about, am I actually building a future that is a future people want to be in? Or am I building a future just to make more money, right? Because this is actually a giant data grab. They want people to talk to these agents for a long time so that they get more information in. And these consequences of AI psychosis, of people who end up harming themselves or others because of this, are treated like edge cases that are like, we can fix that with a filter, while in reality the problem is the actual system itself. Individuals, though, can't impose regulation on AI companies.
No.
But what we can do is understand how the system works, right? So I would say, don't use the voice mode unless you have a good reason to. That is the first part, right? Because don't engage in a conversation with an AI agent unless there's a specific purpose to it. And purpose is like, where does the voice mode bring utility? If you don't have your hands available, if you have
Sure.
some disability, if you have some cause to actually use voice mode, then use it. But don't engage with an AI system as if it's a person you're talking to, because not only is that going to lead you down the path of thinking it's a person, but it's also enormously wasteful, right? You're burning enormous amounts of energy and wasting water doing it. And the conversation that you'll have back and forth will be much longer than it would have been if you were just typing it out. Which brings me to the second part, which is anytime you're using these AI tools, use them as tools and materials. Tools as in you have a task, you want to perform the task, you approach it to solve the task in the quickest possible way. Materials as in you can give the tool a bunch of things and then it generates something in response, and then you can take that and take it outside and use it as a material, in an artwork where you like have mixed materials. So instead of thinking of the system as something that generates something for you and does your job for you, you think of it as something that exists within your toolkit that you use where it's useful, where it brings utility. And the final part is when you are conversing with any AI system, keep in mind that you're not having a conversation. You are writing a document that an autocomplete machine is adding to constantly. And the longer the document gets, the worse the output will get for you. Because the longer that document is, the more nonsense it starts rambling about, right? So start a new chat every time. And whenever you start feeling like the system is not doing what you want, start it. Just take whatever you have at that point, put it over into a new chat and start over. So that you habituate yourself to not building a relationship. Because we build parasocial relationships with everything.
Right.
So actively not doing that becomes important. And finally, if you are sitting or listening to this and thinking, he's wrong. My AI is a person. My liminal intelligence, my sentient
in my gut,
friend,
I just know.
My the thing that I created that I'm migrating off ChatGPT because OpenAI put barriers on this person and destroyed him. If you find yourself in that situation, I urge you to go in and delete the memory on your chat app. Don't save it anywhere. Just delete all of it, all your chats, all the memory settings, because what's happening is the system is tricking you into thinking something is happening, and your reality is delaminating as a result. There is no person inside the system. And if you don't believe me, you can do what I said earlier. Just see if you can copy the chat over into a different chatbot and experience it. And I know a lot of people are doing that now. So at some level, they know. It's a very understandable place to be, but it's a place where you will rapidly fall into an understanding of the world that isn't what is really happening, and it'll become a problem for you over time. And if you're sharing this online, you're dragging other people into that hole with you. And other people are building parasocial relationships to the chatbot that you've generated, which isn't helping anyone. So,
Morten Rand-Hendricksen, I really appreciate the sensitive way you look at this, and the fact that you're looking at it from both a technical and a psychological perspective. We're going to need a lot more of that, I think, in this world. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for this opportunity.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.